Now, the point of this passage is that some woman's going to get pregnant or is pregnant already and is going to give birth, and before the child gets very old, the problem will pass away.
Reminder to hit the subscribe button below and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date as new videos come out. And if you're interested in supporting this ministry, just go to justscripture.org and click on the support page. In parts 1 and 2, we addressed the critics' typical attack on the virgin birth narratives by claiming that Matthew and Luke borrowed this concept from other pagan myths, and/or that both the narratives stand in opposition to the rest of the New Testament writers' so-called silence on the matter. These claims stem off of how critics date the composition of the New Testament books by placing Paul's so-called authentic epistles much earlier than that of the Gospels. That this then creates a large enough gap in time for critics to say that Luke and Matthew employed pagan myths into their narratives. This was easily shown to be bunk after looking into what Paul, Mark, and John actually wrote, and we saw that all three of them actually affirm the virgin conception and incarnation of Jesus. So, with those arguments done away with, it is then we turned our attention to our discussion on Isaiah 7:14. Part 1 dealt with the so-called mistranslation of the Hebrew word alma into virgin, and that Matthew was just repeating the same error of the Septuagint translators. All we had to do here was do a simple word study of the 7 occurrences in the Old Testament to see that the Israelites' understanding of Alma's sexual status was indeed a virgin. Rebekah was directly described as a virgin, and Solomon's Alamot were clearly virgins as well. We now shift our attention to what is arguably the critic's best talking point, in that the prophecy was intended for King Ahaz in his immediate context, and not about the Messiah's coming in the far future. And since we'll be discussing both the context and the chronology of Isaiah 7, is that this study is going to be quite weedy. And because it is so weedy of a topic, is that there are multiple interpretations to parse through. So let's read through Isaiah 7 first to get some working context into our mind. Verse 1. And it came to pass in the days of Ahaz the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin the king of Syria, and Pekah the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up towards Jerusalem to war against it, but could not prevail against it. And it was told to the house of David, saying, Syria, same as Aram on the map, is confederate with Ephraim. And his heart was moved, and the heart of his people, as the trees of the wood are moved with the wind. Then said the Lord unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of Fuller's field. And say unto him, Take heed and be quiet. Fear not, neither be faint-hearted for the 2 tails of these smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin with Syria, and of the son of Remaliah. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken evil counsel against thee, saying, Let us go up against Judah, and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, the son of Tabiel. Thus saith the Lord God, It shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, though, surely you will not be established. Moreover, the Lord spoke again unto Ahaz, saying, Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God, ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. And he said, Hear you now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men? But will you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive, and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhor shall be forsaken of both her kings. The Lord shall bring upon thee and upon thy people and upon thy father's house days that have not come from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Syria. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they shall come and shall rest all of them in the desolate valleys, and in the holes of the rocks, and upon all thorns, and upon all bushes. In the same day shall the Lord shave with a razor that is hired, namely by them beyond the river, by the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it shall also consume the beard. And it shall come to pass in that day that a man shall nourish a young cow and 2 sheep, and it shall come to pass for the abundance of milk they shall give, he shall eat butter, for butter and honey shall everyone eat that is left in the land. And it shall come to pass in that day that every place shall be where there were 1,000 vines at 1,000 silverlings, it shall even be for briars and thorns. With arrows and with bows shall men come hither, because all the land shall become briars and thorns. And on all the hills that shall be digged with mattock, there shall not come here the fear of briars and thorns, but it shall be for the sending forth of oxen and for the treading of the lesser cattle. So ends the chapter. And the first thing that we can establish is the date in which chapter 7 is set in. We have Ahaz, Rezin, and Pekah all ruling simultaneously, with Rezin and Pekah aligned together against Judah. This war is known as the Syro-Ephraimite War, and that is dated taking place between 736 to 732 BC. And in 2 Kings 16, we see that Ahaz didn't listen to Isaiah and instead turned to King Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Assyria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it and carried the people of it captive to Kir and killed Rezin. TP3's conquest of Damascus is generally dated to 732 BC. After you get done reconciling all the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah and compare it to the Assyrian chronology, Samaria was completely destroyed and deported 11 years later after this. The awesome thing for this time period is that there has been so many archaeological findings that back up the biblical accounts. You have the royal bulla of Hezekiah that mentions that he is the son of Ahaz. A bulla of Ahaz has been found that mentions him and his father, King Jotham. And then on the Assyrian side, there are many inscriptions of TP3s from the excavation of the library at Ashurbanipal. One currently residing in the British Museum describes him receiving tribute from Ahaz, as was described in 2 Kings. In other descriptions, or inscriptions, he mentions receiving tribute from Rezin of Damascus and also King Menahem of northern Israel. He also had inscribed how he conquered Syria, as recorded in 2 Kings, and even mentioned that King Pekah was overthrown locally and that he placed Hoshea, northern Israel's last king, over them. But probably the biggest find in recent years is that of the seal of Isaiah the prophet. So don't let anyone try to cause you doubt or claim that Old Testament history is nothing more than myth and legend. With that background in mind, we can now start analyzing the main proposals to see which one best fits the bill. There are 3 main proposals that are presented today. The first one that you have is the near future single fulfillment view. This is advocated by rabbis and critics as that Isaiah 7:14 has nothing to do with the far future, but only with Ahaz and Judah's fight with Rezin Pekah. This is sometimes called the historical fulfillment view. The second one that you have is the far future single fulfillment view, advocated by some Christians as its fulfillment only occurred in Jesus' virgin birth. This is sometimes called the direct fulfillment view. And third is the double fulfillment view, advocated by some other Christians, that essentially says that the prophecy was fulfilled twice, in that the near-term fulfillment foreshadowed a far future fulfillment in Christ. This could be thought of as a typological fulfillment view, similar to how Paul called Jesus our Passover lamb. Since we have multiple Christian views here, is that it demonstrates how controversial this topic really is. But, like any other topic that we cover, is that we're going to really press each one of them to their limits to see if any of them can stand up to scrutiny. Our starting point here has to be with the immediate context of Isaiah 7 and the events that surround it. With that, we're going to go through all the near-term possible candidates named in the Old Testament. You have King Hezekiah, Ahaz's son, who was the next king of Judah. Next you have Syro-Ephraimite, Isaiah's son, named in chapter 7. And Maher-shalal-hash-baz, we'll call him MB for short for the rest of the time, Isaiah's other son that is born in chapter 8. Now, if all three are determined as ineligible, then all that is left is an argument from silence for the critic to work from, or even the Christian proponent of the dual view. And that is not a solid platform to work from. So let's start with Hezekiah. Remember, we showed how this argument started very early on with Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho the Jew. The biggest issue with Hezekiah is chronology. If chapter 7 comes a couple of years before the fall of Damascus, then Hezekiah is already born, because 2 Kings 18:2 says that Hezekiah was 25 years old when he started to reign. Now, for some of you chronology buffs out there, I could imagine some of you saying that the whole co-regency timeline is not what we should be using, and should be using something more similar to that of Archbishop Usher's. Putting that debate aside, the bottom line is that the Old Testament teaches that Hezekiah was already born by this point. First thing is that Ahaz is said to have been 20 years old when he started his reign, and that it lasted for 16 years, making him 36 when he died. We're also told that his reign started in the 17th year of Pekah, and 1527 said that Pekah reigned for 20 years. We are never told how old the northern kings were when they started, but what we have here is a synchronization between Ahaz's age and Pekah's regnal year. This then places Isaiah 7 near this time too. Then 17:1 says that Hoshea started in the 12th year of Ahaz and reigned 9 years. Then finally, with Hezekiah, it says that his reign started in the 3rd year of Hoshea's, and that he was 25 at the time, and this lines up right at the end of Ahaz's life. And when we extend Hezekiah's timeline back 25 years, you see that he was around 9 years old at the time of Isaiah 7. So Hezekiah is out, regardless if you want to use a translation that says that the Alma shall conceive, as in a future conception, or one that presents the Alma as already pregnant. Now, if you're already wondering, what's up with that? Don't worry, we'll be discussing that too. But back to our list is that we see Isaiah's sons are now up to bat and on deck. Syro-Ephraimite is eliminated on the same grounds because he is clearly already born, as Isaiah was instructed to take him with him to go meet Ahaz. So, he can be crossed off the list as well. This leaves us with Maher-shalal-hash-baz, chapter 8, verse 1. Moreover, the Lord said unto me, Take thee a great roll, and write in it with a man's pen concerning Maher-shalal-hash-baz. And I took unto me faithful witnesses to record Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah. And I went unto the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. So you can already see some appeal here because we have a story about a birth of a son coming right after chapter 7. Then said the Lord to me, Call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, My father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria. Here, and in verse 6, they give us a time frame that this occurred in because both Rezin and Pekah are still ruling. So, chapter 8's events fit nicely between 7 and the destruction of Damascus. You have his conception and birth covering about a 10-month period, and 8:4 said before he could say mom and dad that Damascus would be wiped out. So that gives us about a 1 to 2 years frame here before the fall of Damascus. Now, if you are advocating for near-term fulfillment, is that you can see how good this looks initially, but what are the cons to him? First, if you're going to say that 7:14's Alma is the prophetess in 8:3, that is, Isaiah's wife, then you got a definition problem here because the critical side keeps saying that an Alma is just a young, unmarried woman. And even worse from the Christian side, because they keep advocating that an Alma is also a virgin. So what's the problem? Isaiah is already married and had Shear-Jashub. Now, the only possible scenario here is to say that maybe Isaiah's first wife died and that he took a second wife who was an Alma by either definition and then had his second son. This is possible, but you would be arguing from silence on all that again. But the real problems are the textual ones. If you're Isaiah and you're wanting your reader to identify this as the fulfillment, why not use the same word in both cases? Or is he trying to make a distinction here between the two for the reader? Also, what about the naming of the son? 7:14 said the Alma will name the child, whereas 8:3 says that Isaiah is who names the child. And what should be the most apparent difference here are the names. Now, you can say that Emmanuel is merely a symbolic name, and that's fine. But there's no record of Maher-shalal-hash-baz being referred to as Emmanuel. So again, you would be arguing from silence, which in and of itself says that 7:14's Emmanuel prophecy wasn't fulfilled in Maher-shalal-hash-baz. So it's really apparent that Isaiah was making a clear distinction here between his son Maher-shalal-hash-baz and the prophetic son of Isaiah 7:14. So, with all three candidates eliminated, is that all you're left with here is an argument from silence, which is basically self-defeating if you're a Jew or a Christian who is advocating for some type of near fulfillment to have taken place. The atheist is okay in a way because, quite frankly, they don't care about anything being fulfilled or not. They're just trying to show some type of error in the Bible to say that inerrancy and inspiration are bogus notions of people trying to defend their mythical sky god. Now, does that mean that both 1 and 3 are eliminated and 2 is the winner? No. But near-term fulfillment looks about as good as Glass Joe right now at the end of round 1. But before taking a deeper dive into Isaiah 7 is that we need to press the dual view just a little bit more. As said before, proponents of the dual view argue that some type of dual fulfillment occurred in Ahaz's time, but then later foreshadowed a second and greater fulfillment to have taken place in Christ. And what would be pointed to for support of this idea is Matthew's description of Jesus' flight in and out of Egypt as said to be fulfilling Hosea 11:1. But when you go back and look at Hosea 11:1, is that all he is doing is recalling the events of the Exodus. There's nothing forward-looking or predictive in his statement. So, the dual proponent would say something like, this is how Matthew was using Isaiah 7:14, in that it was being fulfilled in a broader sense. If so, then the dual proponent needs to coherently answer the following questions as well. If you're stating that there were two fulfillments, then are you saying that there were two miraculous virgin births as well? They'll have to say no. If they say yes, then they run into a lot of doctrinal issues with that. But by saying no, the dual proponent is then saying that the first fulfillment was a natural conception, while the second fulfillment was done supernaturally. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, look at what God told Ahaz. Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God, ask it either in the depth or in the height above. Or as the NASB says, make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven, meaning that God told Ahaz to go supernatural on this one, so there wouldn't be any doubt in his or the people's minds that God is going to protect them. So, just another girl getting pregnant by natural means hardly fits the text. And another is that the Hebrew definite article ha comes before Alma, very likely putting it into the hearer's and reader's mind that only one Alma was in view here. So the dual fulfillment view can be permanently crossed off, leaving us with the two single fulfillment views. But, as noted earlier, the near future view is already skating on thin ice because all they can offer is Isaiah's silence as proof. But let's go back to our earlier noted translation difference where the NSRV makes it read as though the Alma is already pregnant and would be present with Ahaz in the scene as if Isaiah was pointing her out. This you will see in some other modern versions as well. The Net Bible doesn't say she is already pregnant, but by saying, you, young woman, will name him Emmanuel, conveys the same imagery as if Isaiah was pointing her out in the crowd. However, the majority of versions by far still maintain the traditional rendering as if it will be a future woman that will conceive, bear, and name the prophetic son. But one thing needs to be noted here. If it is shown that the Alma is already pregnant, then the direct far future view is eliminated. If it is shown that the conception is still future, then we've simply allowed the far future view to remain an open possibility. What needs to be determined is if the tense behind the word behold is present or future tense. The last part of the verse is not in question as nobody is arguing that the child is already born. It comes down to whether or not the conception has already taken place. The word behold, or look in some translations, is the word hene in Hebrew. BDB lexicon lists 1,060 occurrences in the Old Testament. First example is found with God telling Adam and Eve to look at what he had created for them, hence past tense. Where this gets interesting for us is starting in Genesis 16 with the story of Ishmael's conception. Verse 4. And Abram went unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, and Sarai was despised in her eyes. So everyone knows that she is pregnant. That leads to Sarai demanding for her to be kicked out. Verse 11. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael. So it sounds really similar to Isaiah 7:14, doesn't it? So it kind of looks pretty good for the present tense currently. But there is another birth announcement where hene comes into play, and that's with Samson. Judges 13:3. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman, and said unto her, Behold, now, thou art barren, and bearest not, but thou shalt conceive, and bear a son. So we have the hene giving an announcement of a future birth of a son. The text made sure that we knew that she was childless. And just in case you think that the Hene here isn't tied to the future birth, verse 5. For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. So, here we have an example of a future conception and birth. But what's the major difference between these two examples? Judges 13 involves a promised son from God himself, which is exactly the same thing that he was doing in Isaiah 7:14. Now I can imagine that my rationale wasn't good enough for some of you out there. So let me drive the stake all the way through it. As we just saw, you can find external examples that support either the present tense or future tense. But what about within the rest of the book of Isaiah? BDB lists 78 total occurrences for Hene in Isaiah. Of these, only 5 were not involved in prophetic utterances from God directly to or through Isaiah. Of these 72, every single one of them were a future tense. So, to say that 7:14's prophecy somehow went against the grain when compared to all the other ones is pretty weak. But the weakest outcome of translating it as if the Alma is already pregnant is that you strip down the miraculous sign that God was going to give them as nothing more than the naming of the son as Emmanuel. A young, already pregnant woman is hardly miraculous, and you cannot consider the naming piece either as well. So, I hope it's obvious by now that the Alma is not presently pregnant. And even if some online rabbinic channel tries to say otherwise, then just follow up with, then why are so many other modern Jewish translations side with the future tense? Now I've argued this from a few different angles that textually, chronologically, and logically eliminated the dual view. And along those same lines, we saw that the near future view struggles because the best that it can offer for fulfillment is some unknown woman and son that neither Isaiah or any other Old Testament writer recorded down. But now it is time to address whether or not the far future view can fit into the context. The main question that critics will throw at us is, what comfort or hope would have this provided Ahaz and the others? And even if we can come up with a coherent answer to this, is how do you then resolve the textual issues of verses 15 and 16? Because look again at what they say. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. So, the critic will say, look, verses 15 and 16 describe more about the prophetic son and quite clearly says that by the point that the boy understands right and wrong, that both Rezin and Pekah will be disposed of. This is by far the best reply a critic can give by pointing out that verses 15 and 16 restrict the prophecy to the immediate context and thus eliminates the far future view. And for this very reason, the dual view was proposed because they recognized the apparent restriction. So, are Isaiah's prophecies in chapter 7 about the near term or the far future? The answer is a little bit of both. What? How can that be? Well, as maybe some of you have guessed already, there's a fourth view that we haven't discussed here, and that is the double reference view. This view says that there are essentially two sets of prophecies presented here. Both near and far future are contained within chapter 7. So, in a way, we're pulling only the strengths out of both of the single fulfillment views because their weaknesses ultimately lead them to dead ends and thus they're eliminated. The first view is eliminated because it doesn't offer any woman and son combo that historically fulfills Isaiah 7:14. The second view is eliminated because it cannot overcome verses 15 and 16 that appears to restrict the prophecy to Ahaz's time. Now, the militant atheist doesn't care about fulfillment and would just say this is a prime example of failed prophecy in the Old Testament and bastardizing of the text by the New Testament to turn Jesus into their sky god. And they did so by shooting all those objections at us, but we have adequately answered and refuted all of them along this journey. So, if this view can unhinge verses 15 and 16 away from verse 14, that would then allow it to go beyond 732 and not rest until it comes upon a son to have said to have been born of a young, unmarried virgin girl. But that would then allow the open potential of this prophecy being messianic in nature. So, in what way or ways is the immediate context of Judah's external threat satisfied? For starters, go back to verse 4 and see what God told Ahaz. God gave him a fourfold encouragement to stop freaking out about the upcoming war because he's ultimately in control. And a couple of these words should have triggered the law of Moses into their heads, where God said, "When thou goest out to battle against thine enemies, and see horses and chariots and a people more than thou, be not afraid of them. For the Lord thy God is with thee, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And it shall be, when you are come nigh unto the battle, that the priest shall approach and speak unto the people, and shall say unto them, Hear, O Israel, you approach this day unto battle against your enemies. Let not your hearts be faint, fear not, and do not tremble, neither be terrified because of them." So you see the same fourfold encouragement here. And they shouldn't fear, because the Lord your God is he that goeth with you to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. Now, I hope that your eyes and ears perked up just a little bit with those two phrases that said, God is with them. Because Emmanuel means God is with us. That type of statement is littered throughout the Old Testament. You can see it being expressed with all the patriarchs. You can see it with Moses, Israel, and Joshua. Then with Samuel and David. Solomon made it part of his prayer request at the temple dedication. And Psalm 46 is all about praising God for being with them and protecting Israel from their enemies. But a really interesting one that I want us to take note of comes from Hezekiah to Jerusalem at the onset of Sennacherib's invasion 33 years after Isaiah 7, telling them not to fear because with us is the Lord our God. The Hebrew here is Amanu Yahweh Elohim. Here, the angel of the Lord ends up saving Jerusalem that night by slaying 185,000 Assyrians, just like how he said he would in Deuteronomy, and is trying to remind Ahaz and the others the same thing here. But God goes on explaining why not to be afraid by calling Rezin and Pekah nothing more than smoking firebrands. This is like calling them smoking cigarette butts, that their time is coming to an end very soon, and they pose no threat. They're all smoke and no fire. Another way that God is trying to encourage them is by referring to Pekah only as the son of Remaliah. Not using his actual name was a declaration from God that he saw him as an illegitimate king, and as such has no problem disposing of him himself. And the final piece of encouragement is in verse 7, where God flat out told him that it's not going to happen. And since he knows the future, he knows the end result already. Then in verse 8, he says that within 65 years, northern Israel will be destroyed and no longer will have any inhabitants in it. And this prophecy was fulfilled, as said 65 years later, when King Esarhaddon of Assyria deported the final remaining Israelites out of the former northern kingdom. Just take note here that God just gave him a prophecy that went well beyond the time of Ahaz. So obviously, God felt that a prophecy that went beyond their immediate circumstances would offer them comfort, because it's an indirect way of telling the house of David that you're going to still be around well beyond the time of Rezin and Pekah. So for all their worrying, God told them not to and gave them plenty of reasons why they shouldn't. This alone should have eased their fears, but it came down to whether or not they really trusted and believed God. But, knowing that they're weak in their faith, God went on by offering Ahaz for any sign that he wants to prove it. But Ahaz, being an evil, unbelieving loser of a king, refuses the Lord. Now, does this negate all of God's earlier promises and predictions of Judah's enemies? No. God's going to keep his word regardless if his people won't trust him. He wasn't going to let the house of David be annihilated because he promised David that his throne and kingdom would endure forever. And even with Ahaz rejecting God's direct and personal help, that he still says that both Rezin and Pekah will be gone in a short time. But because Ahaz didn't trust God and instead made himself and the nation with it and a servant to Assyria, that Judah as a nation would at some point be punished for it by the kings of Assyria, and all this took place as Sargon, especially Sennacherib and Esarhaddon, were constantly terrorizing them, and only God's direct intervention stopped Sennacherib's invasion. So God gave Ahaz and the others plenty of assurance that they're going to survive this war, and that the Davidic line of kings isn't going to be snuffed out in chapter 7. And he even gave them an additional sign and promise of this by Isaiah's second son being born in chapter 8. But how and why would the Emmanuel sign not be part of the near future list? Simple. Ahaz rejected God's offer, and as such, freed it from the immediate circumstances, and this allows it to carry on until a mother and son combo are said to have fulfilled it, even if that means it goes on unfulfilled over 700 years later, which would be no different than how Israel was already waiting for nearly 700 years for a prophet that would arise like unto Moses that would teach and lead them. And the reason why we know that this sign was no longer for Ahaz was that after he rejected God's offer, God said, "Hear now, house of David." And verse 14 said that God was giving the sign instead to the house of David. And the distinction is further shown as the Hebrew switches from the singular in verses 10 through 12 to the plural in 13 and 14. But how are verses 15 and 16 going to be unhinged from verse 14 that would then make this child not be about the Emmanuel son? The answer lies back in verse 3 when God told Isaiah to take Syro-Ephraimite with him. That detail is pointless to mention unless bringing his son had a purpose behind it. And verses 15 and 16 give his presence there a purpose, as Isaiah would be using him as the sign that in a short period of time before he learns how to choose right and wrong, that Rezin and Pekah would be both gone. And Syro-Ephraimite's name has relevant meaning here, as it means a remnant shall return. So the house of David would have recognized this as another sign that they weren't going to be annihilated. And the same is seen with Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz, as his name means swift is booty, speedy is prey. That relates to how Assyria will sweep in and take all the riches of Damascus away. Simply line up these two and you see that Isaiah was using them both as prophetic signs. And what solidifies this is that Isaiah himself said in 8:18, "Behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel, from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion." So we have refuted the critics' last stand against the virgin birth narratives, and in the process have discovered which view holds up when held under the microscope. Now, the only thing left for us to discuss is whether or not 7:14 is about the Messiah. So, what we need to find out is if Isaiah gave us more information about this prophetic son that would make him the King Messiah of Israel. And yes, he does, in chapters 8 through 12. After the small section about Isaiah's second son, the Lord spoke again to Isaiah before Samaria's destruction that the king of Assyria will go after Judah at some point. But he refers to the land as though it belongs to Emmanuel, and then closes off by reminding the people who are siding with Resident Pekah that their alliance is going to fail because God is with the people of Judah, just like he did in 7. So we see how these verses in 8 add to 7:14's understanding. Then Isaiah continued on telling everyone not to fear Resident Pekah's alliance because him and his sons are prophetic signs of their soon defeat, with the chapter ending about how people won't trust the Lord but act like the heathens. The catch here is that chapter 9 is a continuation of this same scene, but switches from a negative to a hopeful future message with national growth and joy because the Lord has delivered them from their enemies. But all of this happens because of verses 6 and 7 that say, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David, and upon his kingdom to order it, and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this." What makes these verses being about the Messiah are not the 4 famous names describing the Son here, although they do help, but that he is being described ruling forever upon the throne of David. And that perfectly hooks back into 7:14 as the house of David was freaking out about the Davidic dynasty ending, that God here is assuring them that it won't end because one day the prophetic son will rule forever on the throne of David. And we see the connection further in that both verses say that a son will be given unto Israel from the Lord himself. Then in 11:1, the son is referred to as the branch coming out of the Davidic line. That is the Holy One of Israel who will rule in Jerusalem forever and ever. That, back in 9:6 and 10:21, say that it is God himself that is ruling them, thus proving that Isaiah 7:14 is about the Messiah being sent into the world and being born of a virgin. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.